Hello there, fellow sonic explorers. Dean Friedman here, director of the New York School of Synthesis. I'm glad you could join us as we continue our investigation into the myriad wonders of synthesis. Right, for the next hour, we are going to examine in further detail the 7 main components of your typical synthesizer. But first, allow me to address an important issue. Is there really such a thing as a typical synthesizer? No, there is not. There are analog synths, digital synths, hybrid synths, FM synths, LA synths, IA synths, and additive synths, and recently we witnessed a virtual explosion of new generation of samplers. Is a sampler a synthesizer? Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. For our purposes, let's call it a special kind of a synthesizer. The point is there are enough similarities between these different kinds of synths to enable us to make some accurate statements about all of them as a group. All synths have some kind of volume envelope. Doesn't matter whether it's a Yamaha DX11 or a Korg M1 or a Roland Juno 2. All synths offer some means for changing the overall shape of a sound. All synths have some sort of LFO. In other words, all synths offer some means by which you can add vibrato or tremolo to a sound. These are synthesizer components that are common to all synthesizers. Once you understand these basic components, you'll then be able to sit down on any kind of synthesizer, regardless of its make or model number, and be able to start programming sounds. But before we get started talking about the similarities between all these synths, namely the 7 main components, let me take a minute to talk about some of the differences. Because a lot of people are confused about the variety of synthesizers out there and the different ways they have of generating sound. So, let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of synthesis. All right, here goes. In the beginning, there were analog synths. This was before the advent of the microprocessor. These days, we refer to any electronic device that evolved before the advent of computer technology as an analog device. In the world of synthesizers, this meant that the raw electrical vibrations generated in the synthesizer circuits traveled directly to the speakers in their original form, where they were then converted into the sound. These were analog synths. When the microprocessor-based synths came along, things changed a little bit. Instead of the sound being generated inside the synth using raw electrical vibrations, the sound was generated digitally, using strings of numbers and complex mathematical formulas called algorithms. So it's like this. Analog or digital refers to how the sound was originally generated. If it's generated by an old-fashioned raw current vibrating oscillator, it's considered analog. If it's generated by a number-crunching digital microprocessor, it's considered digital. But here's the kicker. The fact is that all so-called analog synths today use some kind of microprocessor to manipulate data, even if it's only for storing patches. And even on so-called digital synths, in order to hear those complex number-generated sounds, it's necessary to first convert them to analog form in order for us to hear it coming out of the speaker. So you see, all analog synths employ some digital technology, and all digital synths employ some analog technology. Got that? The truth is, the difference between analog and digital synths is becoming more and more impossible to discern. In some ways, it's simply a question of how an instrument sounds. For our purposes, let's just say that the difference between an analog and a digital synth is in how the sound is originally generated. Synthesizers like the Oberheim Matrix 12 and the Roland Super Jupiter are considered analog. Synths like the Yamaha DX7 and the Ensoniq SQ80 are considered digital. Okay, we've taken care of analog and digital. Let's talk about additive and subtractive. The very earliest experimental synths in sound labs and at universities employed additive synthesis. In additive synthesis, you make sounds by adding together individual sine waves, one on top of the other, until you create your own harmonic spectrum. Additive synthesis is very precise because essentially you're dialing up your own harmonics. But it was also, in the beginning, very cumbersome and expensive because you needed a separate oscillator for each and every harmonic in each and every note. Some sounds might have as many as 24 harmonics, and in those very early synths, you'd wind up with literally a room full of oscillators. So for that reason, when the first commercial synths came out, they abandoned additive synthesis in favor of what's known as subtractive synthesis. In subtractive synthesis, instead of needing a separate oscillator for each and every harmonic, you start out by generating a single waveform rich in harmonics, and then using a filter, you remove or subtract the unwanted portions of the waveform. Having a single filter and oscillator was obviously cheaper and took up less space than additive synthesis, so additive synthesizers took a backseat for a while to the subtractive synthesis model. The early analog synths like the Mini-Moog and the ARPs were subtractive synths. They started out by generating a waveform rich in harmonics, and then using a filter they filtered out or subtracted the unwanted portions of the sound. It's like that classic joke, how do you sculpt an elephant out of a block of wood? Well, the answer is easy. You just take a block of wood and chip away everything that doesn't look like an elephant. Whatever's left will look like an elephant. That's subtractive synthesis. You start with a rich waveform and you subtract the unwanted harmonics. That's how things remained for 15 to 20 years until one day in the early 70s, a guy named John Chowning was fooling around with two sine waves. He was experimenting with modulation. Instead of adding the two sine waves together as in additive synthesis, he was, in a sense, multiplying them together, applying one to the other, modulating the frequency of one with the frequency of the other. This process is known as frequency modulation, or FM, and serves as the basis for the entire DX and TX line of Yamaha, and now several other kinds of synthesizers. What happens in frequency modulation is that by modulating one sine wave with another, you wind up generating a very complex waveform which is extremely rich in harmonics. Getting a complex waveform for the price of only two sine waves was considered a pretty good deal, so Yamaha bought the rights to it and started putting it into their synthesizers. Up until then, Yamaha was only famous for making motorcycles. Casio applied a similar method of generating sound on their CZ series, which they call phase distortion. Phase distortion is related to FM in that it employs a kind of modulation to generate complex waveforms. And then came the samplers. Once samplers came along, it changed the whole ballgame drastically. Samplers make digital recordings of real sounds and then let you play back from a keyboard. The thing about a sampler is that it has no real sound of its own. You can't build a sound from scratch on a sampler. It has whatever sampled sound you happen to load into it at the time. It can be a flute or a piano or a violin or a breaking glass. Even so, samplers obey most of the main rules of synthesis, which is why I still consider them to be a subcategory of synthesizers. They still have a volume envelope. They still have some kind of LFO. Most of them have some kind of filter. So we have analog and digital, additive, subtractive, FM, phase distortion, and samplers. The point is, as synthesizers continue to evolve, we see more and more systems that actually use more than one kind of synthesis to generate sound. These newer systems become more difficult to define, so let's just call them hybrids. One of these hybrids is a group of synths that use complex digitally stored wavetables, kind of samples, as source material instead of just the simple square wave and triangle waveforms we're familiar with. Synths like the Korg DW6000 introduced this analog-digital hybrid. Since then, even the hybrids have evolved. Synths like the Korg M1, the Ensoniq SQ80, and the Roland D50 allow you to mix digital samples of real acoustic sounds with digital versions of traditional analog synth waveforms, such as square wave and triangle waves. You can then use an analog-type filter, a tool of subtractive synthesis, to alter the sound. Roland calls their hybrid version LA synthesis. The letters are supposed to stand for linear algorithmic synthesis, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out that coincidentally they're also the initials of a densely populated smog-ridden city on the West Coast known for its designer pizza. These synths, which employ digital samples or PCMs as part of their source material, combine some of the best features of both samplers and synthesizers in a single box. So have you got all of this straight in your head? There are analog synths, there are FM synths, there are additive synths, there are samplers, and now we have hybrids, which are part sampler and part traditional synthesizer. Boy, oh boy, How do you tell which is which? It doesn't matter. Regardless of how they do it, they all have to address the same three elements of sound. They all offer some way of altering pitch, some way of manipulating timbre, and some way of controlling volume over time. So now that you have some idea about the different kinds of synths that are out there, let's start figuring out how to make sounds on them. To briefly review what we've covered in Part 1, the 7 main components are the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, the pitch envelope, and the LFO. And here's a quick explanation of their functions. The amplifier controls loudness. The oscillator controls pitch. The filter controls brightness or timbre. The volume envelope is the first of 3 envelope generators that, together with the amplifier, creates the overall shape of a sound over time. The filter envelope is the second of the 3 envelope generators that, together with the filter, creates the shape of a sound's harmonic content over time. The pitch envelope is the third of the 3 envelope generators that, along with the oscillator, controls the shape of a sound's pitch over time. And the LFO wiggles the sound. In other words, it adds some kind of modulation to a sound, such as vibrato or tremolo. The particular type of modulation depends on which other component is being modulated. For example, if you modulate the oscillator, you get vibrato. If you modulate the amplifier, you get tremolo. Okay. So let's start again from the beginning and examine each of these 7 main components in greater detail. The amplifier controls loudness or volume, also sometimes referred to as level. Some synths allow you to set a balance between the levels of 2 or more parts of a single voice. This is the panel of the Ensoniq SQ80, a digital crosswave synthesizer. And if we look at the lower part of the split screen, surprise, surprise, we have very familiar synthesizer components. We have the OSC, the oscillators. We have DCA, which are the amplifiers. We have a filter. We have envelopes. And we have LFOs. All of these comprise the 7 main components we've been talking about all along. On the Ensoniq SQ80, the level parameter in the amplifier section allows you to adjust the relative amplitude or volume level between the 3 oscillators. Let's see how we can adjust the relative level of the amplifier between the click sound in oscillator 1 and the sawtooth wave in oscillator 2. First, let's introduce a maximum level for the click. Now let's go to the DCA for oscillator 2 and introduce a level for the sawtooth wave. This is an example of how we use the amplifier to control the relative level amounts or volume amounts between 2 oscillators. This is the panel of the Roland D50, another hybrid synth which, like the Ensoniq SQ80, offers you the ability to combine PCM samples along with digital versions of traditional analog waveforms. As on the SQ80, setting the relative volume amounts between the different oscillators that make up a single voice is a job for the amplifier. This is usually referred to as balance. Remember, although the term amplifier is not being displayed, the setting of relative amplitude or volume amounts is an amplifier function. Whereas the Ensoniq SQ80 has 3 oscillators per voice, the Roland D50 offers you 4 oscillators per voice, or what they refer to as partials. By moving the D50's joystick from side to side, I am able to adjust the relative balance between two of the four partials or oscillators. Partial number 2 is dedicated to an analog waveform. And if I change the balance, you can hear that analog waveform introduced, along with the digital sample of the attack of a real harp sound. Here's the real harp. Here's the real harp with the analog waveform. Those are some of the amplifier volume parameters that can be set directly. Others are set indirectly. For example, when you apply modulation from the LFO to the amplifier, you don't set it at the amplifier. You normally do that from the LFO section. Similarly, when you create a volume envelope, you are in fact controlling the amplifier, but the adjustments that you make are in the volume envelope section. Remember, even if you don't see the word amplifier laid out neatly on your synthesizer panel, believe me, somewhere in your synthesizer is a component or parameter that allows you to control the volume or amplitude of your sound. Next comes the oscillator, often labeled VCO, DCO, OSC, or frequency. The oscillator controls pitch. This is a component that comes in many different forms and disguises. But remember, whatever you call it, it controls the frequency or the pitch of a sound. Let's look at a few of them. Here's the oscillator page on the Ensoniq SQ80. Let's examine the kinds of parameters we can find in the typical oscillator section. Over here we see the wave select. And as we cycle through these stored digital waveforms, we'll see, again, familiar looking waveforms. The square wave, a pulse wave, a sawtooth wave, and a sine wave. The very waves that we talked about in the beginning of the series. In addition to those analog-like waveforms, there are a variety of digitally sampled waveforms, all of which can be selected as source material for a sound. Some of the other parameters found in the oscillator section are your octave switch or range switch, which changes the pitch of the oscillator by an octave, the semitone parameter, which changes the pitch of the oscillator by half step, and the fine-tuning control. These are typical oscillator parameters. All of these functions somehow affect the pitch. The SQ80 allows us to combine up to 3 oscillators simultaneously in a single sound. If we turn on the second oscillator in the DCA section, that is the amplifier section, by engaging the output parameter, turning it on, we hear both oscillators at once. If we examine oscillator number 2, we'll see the waveform is a brass wave. Let's see what happens when we detune these 2 oscillators by changing the fine-tuning of oscillator 2 relative to oscillator 1. By slightly altering the tuning, we achieve a chorusing effect. This is the front panel of the Korg M1. The Korg M1 is another hybrid, like the Ensoniq SQ80 and the Roland D50. It offers a variety of digital sampled waveforms along with digital versions of traditional analog waveforms, and allows you to modify them in traditional analog terms. The M1 is a dual oscillator system, and as you can see, it contains familiar oscillator parameters. This is the oscillator page, and this parameter, the octave parameter, allows us to set the range of the oscillator. The overall octave. If we go to the oscillator 2 page, not only can we change the range as well as the amplitude level, we can change the interval between the oscillators. We can also detune these two oscillators to achieve a chorusing effect. This is the front panel of the Roland D50, another PCM-based hybrid. The Roland D50 is a 4-oscillator system. Roland refers to each of these 4 oscillators as partials, and they let you select waveforms and control pitch, just like every other oscillator. So let's take a look at them. Except this time, instead of observing these oscillator functions on the D50's own graphic display, let's make use of an extremely helpful computer program called D50 Master by SoundQuest. This is what's known as voice editing software. It displays all the internal voice parameters of the D50 on a computer screen in such a way that you can easily see the entire voice architecture of a sound in a single glance. It is much easier than having to punch up parameter after parameter on the D50's own small graphic display. For example, in partial 2, we can alter the pitch by clicking in on the pitch parameter and moving the mouse back and forth. We can also alter the fine-tuning of the pitch. We can also select different waveforms, the triangle wave or a pulse wave. And, as is generally the case when a pulse wave is offered on a synthesizer, they provide the means for you to manipulate the width of that pulse wave. This parameter allows us to alter the width, or the duty cycle, of the pulse wave. Listen how the timbre changes as the width of the pulse wave changes. This is the detune section of this Casio CZ, and it allows us to detune the dual oscillator system by intervals of an octave, by notes, intervals, or by fine-tuning. This is a handy way of adding chorusing to the sound. Chorusing, or detuning, is an excellent way to turn an otherwise boring sound into an interesting and usable one. It's simple to do and it's very effective. In fact, the effect is so useful and common that many synths today offer a separate chorus button, which when pressed automatically detunes the oscillators of a sound slightly apart to achieve the desired chorusing effect. The advantage to being able to combine multiple sound sources to create a single voice is obvious. You can create a harmonically rich and interesting composite sound to use as your source material. And that's before you even start manipulating it with filters and envelopes and the like. Making intelligent choices early on while selecting source material in the oscillator section is an important first step in designing sounds. The right choice at this stage will take you that much further towards your sound goal. Okay, now comes the fun part. I've got to explain all about filters. But half of you own synths like Yamaha DXs and Casio CZs that don't actually have a filter on them. So bear with me, because here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to show you the parameters of your typical filter. Parameters like the filter cutoff point and resonance. And then I'll talk about some of the components on other kinds of synths that serve approximately the same function as a filter. Components such as the modulators on the DX series. Okay, here goes. The filter, also known as the VCF, controls the harmonic content of a sound. Its overall brightness. Here's the filter section of the Prophet 600, an analog synth. The main control in any filter section is the cutoff control, which is where you determine the point at which the filter will begin cutting off the harmonics within the sound. This represents the working edge of the filter. This is the filter page in the Korg M1. Notice it's labeled VDF, Variable Digital Filter, although I like to think of it as a very digital filter. The point is whatever they call it, it's a filter. And just like the filter on the original analog synths, it's got a cutoff point. When you open the filter, the sound gets brighter. As you close the filter, the sound gets duller. Brighter, duller. Let's examine the filter on the SQ80. As you see from the panel, there are familiar filter parameters. We can control the frequency or the filter cutoff point of the filter. As we open the filter, the sound gets brighter. As we close the filter, the sound gets duller. Here's the filter control in the D50, the cutoff frequency control for this partial. Watch what happens to the filter as I change the filter's cutoff frequency. Brighter or darker? The next most important parameter in the filter section is called resonance. Resonance acts to exaggerate the harmonic frequencies that occur right at the filter cutoff point. The effect of this is that resonance can add a particular kind of rushing energy to a sound, a sort of controlled feedback. Resonance. You can hear how the resonance will exaggerate the harmonics at the filter cutoff point. It's more evident when I actually move the filter cutoff point. It's even more obvious when I design a filter envelope that makes the cutoff point move over time. That wah-wah effect is a result of resonance. Here's an example of resonance on the filter page of the Ensoniq SQ80. Select the value for resonance. And you can hear the resonance, that is, the exaggerated harmonics around the filter cutoff point. Resonance on the D50. Listen to what happens to the sound as I increase the resonance. One last parameter that is typically located in the filter section of a synthesizer is known as envelope amount. Envelope amount controls the degree to which the filter envelope affects a sound. On the Korg M1, the envelope amount parameter is referred to as EG intensity, envelope generator intensity. They call it by a different name, but it performs the same function. It determines the degree to which the filter envelope will affect the cutoff point of the filter. Roland refers to the envelope amount parameter on their D50 as envelope depth. One of the fun games that I enjoy on those long, boring winter nights is to try and figure out how many different names synthesizer manufacturers have come up with to describe the same exact parameters. Envelope amount, envelope depth, envelope intensity. Different names for the same parameter. Okay, so that's the traditional filter model. So what about you poor FM synthesis guys? How does this apply to you? Well, put simply, on an FM synthesizer, and that includes any of the Yamaha DX or TX series, or some of the new Korg synths, there is a component that is responsible for controlling the harmonic content of the sound. It's called the modulator. Now, a traditional filter changes harmonic content of a sound by removing or replacing the upper portions of the harmonic spectrum. This is referred to as subtractive synthesis, because the filter is subtracting the unwanted portions of the original harmonically rich waveform. Now, a modulator changes harmonic content by adding harmonics to a sound. It does this through a process called frequency modulation, FM. Actually, frequency modulation is more like multiplication. One waveform modulates another waveform, and you wind up with a very rich and complex waveform. In any case, the point of all this is that on an FM synth, it is the modulator that controls the harmonic content of a sound. Or to put it another way, it is the job of the modulator to control the timbre of a sound. So listen to what happens as you increase the level of a modulator. In order to increase the brightness in a sound. Okay, so it's not a filter, but don't you see, it does the same thing. It serves a similar purpose. They both address the same element of sound, timbre. Oh, and just in case you Casio owners out there thought I was going to abandon you to the vagaries of phase distortion, let me add, on Casio CZ synths, the parameter that is responsible for controlling timbre is called the DCW. In fact, the DCW on a CZ synth is very similar to the modulator on a DX synth. The point is, all of these components, the filter, the modulator, and the DCW, while they are not identical in as far as how they do what they do, they all do essentially the same thing. They alter a sound's timbre. So far, we've chosen and then slightly manipulated our source material in the oscillator section. Then we've gone ahead and altered the timbre of our sound in the filter section, or by adjusting the modulator or DCW. Now let's go and design an overall shape for our sound. After all, every sound deserves a shape. And if you've been paying any attention at all up until now, you'll know that that's a job for the volume envelope. We're going to look at a few different kinds of volume envelopes. Again, try and keep in mind that even though the structure of these volume envelopes may differ from machine to machine, they're essentially doing exactly the same thing. As I said earlier, my purpose in doing this is to familiarize you with the common parameters of a typical synth and their functions, in order that you may then be able to sit down at any synthesizer and know how to start programming it. So, a volume envelope is a volume envelope. It doesn't matter what machine it's on. Let's start with a familiar analog type ADSR envelope, just to get our feet wet. ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now, before we continue, I have to caution you. There is an invisible fifth stage in an ADSR envelope, and it's called peak. It's not written on your synthesizer panel. It's not mentioned in your manual, but it's there, and I'm telling you about it now. Peak is the maximum volume level of a sound, and it is located between attack and decay. All right? Now you know. And aren't you glad I told you? Oh, one other word of caution. Don't confuse piano terminology with synthesizer terminology, okay? In the world of acoustic pianos, remember acoustic pianos, don't you? They're made of wood. The word sustain has a specific meaning in regards to the sustain pedal, and it implies extending the tail end of a note so that it dies out gradually. On a synthesizer, the word sustain means something else entirely. Don't confuse the two. So, from the beginning, if you want to alter the beginning of a sound's shape, you change its attack. Increase the attack and the sound begins gradually. Decrease the attack and the sound begins suddenly. Attack is a rate control. It determines the speed that it takes the sound to go from 0 volume level to the next level, and that next level just happens to be peak. Peak is the point at which a sound reaches its maximum volume level. It is a fixed automatic setting. You can't change it. That's why it has no knob, but it's there. Every time you press a key, the volume of a note will go from 0 level to peak level at the speed of attack. Once a sound reaches its peak level, it continues immediately to the next volume level, and the next volume level is known as the sustain level. The stage between the peak level and the sustain level is called decay. Decay is a rate, and it determines the speed at which a sound's volume level travels from peak to sustain. Now, the sustain level is the volume level at which a note will stay for as long as you hold your finger down on the key. If you hold your finger on the key for 30 seconds, the note's volume will remain at the sustain level for 30 seconds. When you finally take your finger off the key, the volume level will finally return to 0 volume level at the rate of release. Envelopes take some getting used to, but let's just try and make some basic changes to this envelope to see what's involved in manipulating the ADSR, or any envelope generator. We have our attack, which we can slow down. Or speed up. And we have our release, which we can slow down or speed up. We can also remove the sustain level. Now listen, having removed the sustain, what we're left with is the peak portion of the envelope. What's happening is the envelope is cycling instantly to peak and back to 0 again, leaving us a click. We can lengthen that click by either slowing down the attack going to peak or slowing down decay going from peak back to 0. Let's slow down the attack and hear what happens. The envelope is going gradually from 0 to peak and then instantly back to 0. Or we could expand the click in the other direction to go from peak to sustain by increasing the amount of decay. At this point, the envelope goes instantly to peak and then gradually from peak to the sustain level, which is 0. We can create a swell, or a hump in the sound, by slowing down the attack and the decay. So in a sense, the envelope is going gradually up to peak and gradually back down. So anyway, to sum up, we press a key and the note travels from 0 to peak at the rate of attack. Then it travels from peak to sustain at the rate of decay. And then, usually it travels from sustain back to 0 again at the rate of release. Got that? It's simple enough. 4 levels and 3 rates. Huh? Did I say 4 levels and 3 rates? What is he talking about? I thought these were ADSRs, and now he's talking about rates and levels just like on the Yamaha Casio envelopes. What gives? Just what I said. Peak and sustain are levels, and so is zero. In fact, there are two zero levels, the initial zero level and the final zero level. Three of them, initial zero, peak, and final zero, are fixed levels, but they're levels just the same. Sustain is the only variable level. And attack, decay, and release are three rates. They determine the speed it takes to get from one level to the next. So, ADSRs are really not all that different than the newer 4- and 8-stage envelopes. Let's look at one and see how they're the same and how they're not. This is the EG, or envelope generator section of the DX7. It consists of rates and levels. 4 rates and 4 levels. Let's see what happens when we slow down rate number 1. Remember, rate number 1 would be analogous to what we know of as the attack portion of a volume envelope. Let's slow down rate number 4. Rate number 4 would be analogous to the release portion of an ADSR envelope. This is the volume envelope on the Korg M1. They've chosen to label it VDA1EG, which stands for something like Variable Digital Amplifier 1 Envelope Generator. Whatever they chose to call it, it's a volume envelope. And it has familiar stages. It has attack time, attack level, decay time, what they refer to as breakpoint, a slope time, and sustain level. Breakpoint is simply a level that falls between the first attack level and the sustain level. They've chosen to give it a name called breakpoint, and the rate between breakpoint and sustain, they've chosen to give a name called slope time. Whatever they call these parameters, these stages of the envelope, they still are rates and levels. And in this case, we have 4 rates and 3 levels. The 4th level is assumed because it's the last level, which is going back to 0. So let's hear what happens to the sound if we slow down the attack. And if we add a little release, we select the release parameter. The same rules of volume envelopes apply, regardless of what the stages are named. We're dealing with rates and levels. The level of the volume is going from 0 to one level, to another level, to another level, and finally back to 0. In the architecture on the SQ80, envelope number 4 determines the overall volume envelope for the sound. As you can see from the display on top, there are 3 levels, level 1, 2, and 3, and 4 rates, or times. Let's confirm that this is the overall volume envelope by changing the rate of the attack, that is, the first time parameter. Fast, slow, fast, slow. Let's take a look at the volume envelope of the D50. We click in on the volume envelope icon in parcel number 2. That's the square here. And the volume envelope is displayed, both numerically in times and levels, as well as graphically. See how easy it is to change the shape of the envelope simply by clicking and dragging onto the graphic envelope display. If we want to slow down the attack, we simply reshape the envelope. The same is true of the release portion of the envelope. Witness how easy it is to design a double attack in this volume envelope simply by dragging down level 2. So, now you know all about volume envelopes. They can have short attacks or long attacks, short releases or long releases, and sometimes they can have a bump or a hump or two in the middle. And now the filter envelope. Now the first thing to remember here is that the structure of all envelope generators is the same. The ADSR, or the rate level structure of a filter envelope, is exactly the same as that of a volume envelope. They are the same exact controls: attack, decay, sustain, release. Except instead of controlling the amplifier and loudness, as does the volume envelope, the ADSR of the filter envelope controls the filter or brightness. Of course, by now I hope you understand that when I say filter envelope, I'm including those systems that don't have filters, but that do control the harmonic spectrum of the sound. Perhaps a better generic term would be if instead of filter envelope, I said harmonic envelope or brightness envelope. In any case, they all imply the same thing. Just as the volume envelope controls the shape of a sound's volume over time, the filter envelope, or harmonic envelope, controls the shape of a sound's brightness over time. Now this is a simple concept to understand. Basically, what we're doing is superimposing one envelope over another. The filter envelope is being superimposed over the volume envelope. Here's a graphic display of the filter envelope on the Roland D50. Listen how easy it is to alter the filter envelope simply by clicking and dragging on the graphic display. This is the filter envelope, or the harmonic envelope, on the Korg M1. They call it the variable digital filter EG envelope generator. Listen to what happens as we slow down the attack rate of the filter envelope. Filter envelopes, or harmonic envelopes, can create a shape for the brightness within the overall shape of the volume envelope. They add even more dynamic internal motion to the sound. Remember, think of the filter envelope and the volume envelope as one envelope superimposed over the other. And so we come to the pitch envelope. The pitch envelope controls the direction of the sound's pitch. It does this by sending rate and level controls to the oscillator, which, as we know, controls pitch. With a pitch envelope, you can make a sound's pitch slide up, or you can make its pitch slide down, or you can make it slide up and down. The thing is, when you're dealing in the realm of pitch, it's easy to hear quite clearly the shape of the envelope and how it goes up and down. For the most part, the pitch envelope behaves exactly as do the other two envelopes. Here's a display of the pitch envelope on the Roland D50. 0 represents the center pitch, and a range of plus or minus 50 allows you to slide up to the pitch or down to the pitch. Here's the pitch envelope page on the Korg M1. Listen what happens if I set all my times, or rates, so that they travel slowly. The attack, decay, and release times. And I move from a high start level to a low attack level to a high release level. And that's the pitch envelope. It can slide up, or it can slide down, or it can slide up and down. It's useful for creating automatic pitch bends or for swooping special effects, or used more subtly for adding a touch of realism to the attack portion of some brass and woodwind instruments, or even the voice. Those kinds of subtleties are the sorts of things that help make a synthesized sound more convincing. And the pitch envelope can help you do it. So let's see where we are. We've talked about the amplifier and how it controls volume. We've gone over the oscillator and how it controls pitch. We've discussed the filter and how it controls timbre or brightness. We've even talked about those three amazing envelopes, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, and the pitch envelope, and how they each control a different aspect of sound by sending instructions to the amplifier, the filter, and the oscillator, respectively. So, what's left? Yes. The LFO, the low frequency oscillator. The LFO wiggles the sound. Yes, I said wiggle. A more mature and grown-up expression might be modulate. The LFO modulates the sound. That is, it imparts a continuously repeating vibration to some aspect of the sound, such as the volume, or the timbre, or the pitch. The effect of the LFO is contingent on which other component the LFO is being sent to. We call this routing. So, for example, if we route the LFO to modulate the amplifier, we achieve amplitude modulation. Another word for amplitude modulation is tremolo. If we route the LFO to modulate the oscillator, we get what's called frequency modulation. And another word for frequency modulation is vibrato. If we route the LFO to the filter, we get filter modulation. And there is no other word for filter modulation. We just call it filter modulation. Remember the pulse wave from the 5 most common waveforms? Well, it's even possible to route the LFO so that it controls the width of the pulse wave. Each of these techniques represents a way of imparting a different kind of internal motion to a sound. It helps make the sound more interesting, and it goes a long way towards making a synthesized sound less mechanical by emulating to some degree the way we humans tend to reproduce sounds. This page allows us to assign LFO to modulate the pitch. It's labeled pitch MG, or pitch modulation generator, and it has familiar settings for an LFO. It allows us to select different waveforms, to change the frequency, to add delay, intensity, or amount. Let's see what happens when we increase the amount. And let's see what happens when we select a different waveform. We can change the frequency or the rate. And we can add a certain amount of delay. This page on the Korg M1 allows us to control the LFO to the filter. We can control the amount of the modulation, or the intensity. We can control the speed of the modulation. And we can control or select the waveform that does the modulating. Here's the LFO on a DX7 synthesizer. Again, we see familiar parameters. Let's see what happens if we increase the pitch modulation depth. Let's change the speed. let's change the waveform. Another parameter in the LFO section is LFO sync, which determines the direction in which the LFO modulating wave is traveling every time you trigger the key. When sync is off, the modulation begins in a different place every time you strike a key. When sync is on, every time you strike a key, the LFO will travel from the same exact point in the same direction. Here's the LFO page on the Ensoniq SQ80. As you can see, all the familiar values for LFO are on this page. We can select the LFO level, otherwise known as LFO amount or intensity. We can also select the frequency or the rate or speed of the LFO. Another familiar LFO parameter is wave select, where we can choose from among triangle waves, or sawtooth waves, square waves, or a random wave, or what's labeled here as a noise wave. So, you got that? The LFO wiggles the note. And that's it. Go make yourself a sardine sandwich, pop open a beer, and watch the ball game. You deserve it. Seriously. There are, of course, a variety of stray parameters such as noise, sync, cross-modulation, and keyboard tracking that tend to be instrument-specific. But if you understand the 7 main components that we've just gone over, you'll be able to make sounds. You see, when you're programming your own synthesized sounds, it's always useful to experiment and twiddle knobs and use your intuition. You can come up with some good sounds that way, just fooling around. That's fine. But to really get the most out of your instrument, you really need to know how to make a sound on purpose. That's why understanding these 7 main components and how they relate to the 3 elements of sound, pitch, timbre, and volume, can help you make intelligent choices when you're programming. On part 3 of this 3-part series, we'll concentrate on actually designing sounds or modifying existing sounds, applying the rules and principles we've covered in the first 2 tapes. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, just drop us a line at the New York School of Synthesis, P.O. Box 878, Ansonia Station, New York, New York, 10023. And if it's not too crazy around here, we'll try and answer you. Anyway, this is Dean Friedman for the New York School of Synthesis saying, happy programming, everybody.